Welcome and good afternoon. Today's session is the first in a two-part training for service providers who are seeking to engage and build relationships with Indigenous families and communities. Through a framework of levels of relationship, we'll explore the concept of engagement as it pertains to tribal communities and examine how understanding of engagement may differ depending on the cultural context and level of collaboration. Over the course of the next two sessions, our presenters will share strategies to advance engagement with the Indigenous families and communities with whom you work. Next slide. Our presenters today are Shannon Crosper and Veronica Willetto, and we are welcoming them back. Shannon and Veronica most recently presented another two-part series on tribal organization outreach and collaboration for us in February, and you can find that recording and materials on our website. We're excited to have them share their knowledge and expertise with us over the next 2 weeks. And I'm actually going to turn it over to them now so that they can tell you more about themselves before we move into the training content. Veronica and Shannon, we are so excited to have you back.
Thank you, Dana. My name is Shannon Crossbear. I'll give you a little bit more of an introduction in a moment, but I just want to welcome everybody here. I'm going to do that in my language, so I'm just going to say Minagijagad Indaway Maganak, which is just greeting you in the Ojibwe language, saying hello, and greeting you as my relatives. And we kind of like to start with just kind of getting to know each other in the room. So if you would put in your chat, put in the chat where you're from, and if you know the ancestral lands on which you reside, if you could put that in there, that would be great. You'll see that in the chat, they've dropped a link. If you don't know the Indigenous lands that you are residing on, I encourage you all to take a look at that guide so that you can learn about that and know about that. So yeah, we have lots of people answering in here. Thank you. Okay, great. We've got Mi'kmaq and Squamish and Pomo and great. And Wyatt and Wapo lands and great. Yeah, I'm always reminded about how many tribes you have there in California that are represented. It looks like we have quite a bit of great representation. So just so you know, I'm from the Ojibwe lands in northern Minnesota. Here's some pictures of where I live. I'm Ojibwe and Irish, but I grew up on my homelands of the Lake Superior Ojibwe. And I think it's so important we have this land connection. So it's who I am and where I'm from. We're water protectors and woodlands peoples here. So and I'm coming to you today with the National Child Trauma Center and really being able to look at kind of the work that we're doing to help encourage good support for our Indigenous families, no matter where they're at. So, right, we got Chippewa in the room. Yes, great. So, this is always very encouraging to me when I see that people are responding and that they're the awareness of where they're at and the lands that they live on are, being acknowledged in this way. So, Veronica, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, welcome everyone. Yate, share Veronica Willetto di Crane Yanishia. One son and Nishlena Krena Bashin, Torajin Dashinale, Trenasani Dashiche. Tetch be Torten, Ashadop Billings, Montana, da Kirste. So I could ego the son Nishle. So I just introduced myself in my language. I'm the Navajo, and The photos that I'm sharing on the screen right now are of, the one on the right is of my homeland where I grew up. It's a really small community called Ojo Encino, the Navajo Nation, and in New Mexico. And so our tribe, our homelands extend into New Mexico and Arizona and Utah. So that is the portion of the lands that I grew up on is in New Mexico. And then the picture on the left is of Billings, Montana. It's from the view of the Rim Rocks overlooking the city. And so that's where I live now with my family. I'm a mother of 6 children and married to my husband, who is a member of the Crow Nation. So that's a little bit about who I am.
Thanks, Veronica.
And I'll just add to that, Billings is the traditional homelands of the Crow people, as well as other Plains tribes like Blackfeet, Cheyenne, and the different Sioux nations.
Thanks, Veronica.
All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and continue on. And I just want to first give us a look at what we'll be walking through together the next 2 weeks. So today we're going to be looking specifically at the definition of family, and we're going to be thinking about the 4 R's and working with tribal communities and tribal families and the different levels of relationships that can occur. And we're going to be, throughout our whole time, describing the Indigenous cultural context and making note of ways in which it might be distinct from perhaps the more dominant cultural context that we are more familiar with and we're more familiar with working within. And we're going to be also discussing specifically the concept of engagement and how that might differ in terms of how Indigenous worldviews might look at engagement. And for the next session, we'll be focusing much more on strategies. We will offer some today, but we'll focus a lot more next session on the different strategies for engagement. And then giving opportunity for all of us to reflect and assess on our current practice of being in relationship with Indigenous families. And we hope to share some tools along this journey with you that might be helpful for you as you strengthen and foster those relationships with Indigenous families.
So, thanks, Veronica. I continue to look in the chat, and one of the things that I was just reflecting on as I was looking was just how much wisdom and expertise we have in the room. I can tell that some of the folks that are in the room are from tribal communities, and certainly want to recognize your own Indigenous knowledge coming here. So, we thought last time we started this process by really spending some time doing a little bit of reflection. So everybody came here today. It's on engaging Indigenous families and communities. But we always want people to think a little bit deeper, like you had a reason that you came to this particular session. So we want to take a little bit of time to have you reflect on, what is the reason for your engagement? Why do you want to connect with Indigenous populations? Is it for your work? Is it for your own knowledge? Is it because you're interacting with families? Is it because you recognize that maybe not at the present time, but the likelihood of you in the work that you're doing being that you're going to be serving Indigenous people, that what are your reasons, and what specifically do you hope, why do you hope to engage with those families? What is the purpose of that? And what do you hope that the outcome will be? So we're just going to give you a few minutes here. We're going to put a beautiful picture up. If you go to the next, there you go. So we want to just give you a few minutes. Maybe you have a piece of paper. Maybe you have something that you want to jot something down on in terms of what is your intention? What is it that you would like to see in terms of your engagement with Indigenous people? And we're just going to give you a minute to reflect on that. So if anybody wants to come off mute and share, they're, you're not required to, but if you want to do that, that would be great.
Hey there. I'm going to use my ancestral language to greet everybody. Tiali Kuali Tonali. Newanotoka Javier Garcia, Tlasokamati. I personally, my family is Nahuatl speaking, Indigenous communities from Mexico and Western United States. In addition to that, I provide support for cultural programs for Nahuatl speaking community members, especially in San Jose, California. Professionally, here at the Carolyn E. Wiley Center, where we work, have colleagues here as well. We're right in the middle of lands of Coahuila tribal members. And so just gaining some insight with regards to how can we better serve our community and the populations that we serve. We definitely focus on themes of trauma, especially intergenerational and transgenerational trauma. So really excited to be here and hear from you all.
Thanks. I appreciate that. And we will be touching on the historical trauma today. So glad that you're right there for that. We've got others that have been responding in the chat for being better informed about the culture. And it looks like Angel has her hand raised. I didn't see it on. Oh, his. Okay, I see you, Angel.
No, hi everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm a program manager for Mixteco Indigena, or Indigenous Community Organizing Project here in Ventura County. Most of my staff speak Mixteco variant language, and we try to work with the Indigenous community, mostly with the work in the farm fields in Ventura County and Santa Barbara County. Really love my job, but unfortunately, I'm one of the staff that don't speak Indigenous language, but my staff is teaching me. So I'm really glad to be here and just better interact with the families myself. So
Great. Thank you, Angel. And we see Desiree, she's talking about the groups that she works with, the communities, and that she's actually between a couple of communities that are amazing, tribal rancheros and rancherias, and really being able to combat the stereotypes. So hopefully we can create a learning environment together with our time together. So great. I'm just really, again, welcoming all of you. So Veronica, yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much for sharing intentions. I think it's really important, and I think it's one of the values that we find in many tribal communities is the importance of setting intentions. And so, and being led by those intentions and making those intentions clear. So, and being able to be reflective of those intentions that we have. So thank you, Shannon, for taking us through that reflection activity to get us started. So I'm going to go ahead and take us along to the next portion of our session today. And I'm really going to be talking about the families that you're serving. And some of you have made note in your responses that you are wanting to connect more with the families that you're serving, and you want to provide better services. And sometimes in our line of work, we might be really focused on that one family or the family that is on our caseload, or the families within our communities. And we're learning about, you know, their family and what is going on with them, and trying to get to know them a little bit better. So we thought it would be helpful to try to put that into perspective. Part of some of the Indigenous worldviews that we come from, that we have in common, is that we often will look at things from a more generational perspective. And so sometimes, you know, our service systems are really focused on the now, and really focused on sometimes individuals. And so we want to be able to provide more of a context to the families that you're serving by taking a more generational view. So I'm going to start way back and multiple generations ago. Before the onset of colonization, I think it's important for us to know and to understand that Indigenous families have been residing on this land for millennia, and that societies were flourishing, and there were multiple nations and multiple communities and lots of families that were residing here on this land. And so sometimes that's really difficult for us to imagine, because we may have become more used to the more popular, or maybe the more common view of Indigenous families, and that they're few and far in between, or that in a lot of cases they may be invisible to us. But try to imagine that before the onset of colonization, there were lots of Indigenous families, and they were flourishing, and they served just a myriad of roles. They had all types of systems that were in place to really take care of one another, and ensure that everyone was living with good health and well-being. And so what I have here are just some examples of some of the roles that families had during that time. They were teachers, they were protectors, they were providers, they were decision makers, caregivers, and knowledge keepers. And I think it's really important to know this, because sometimes in what we learn about Indigenous families today, these roles can sometimes get lost, or because of what we're seeing and the impact of trauma, we might forget that the roles of these families continue to be important, all of these different roles that they have, and be able to see our families in these ways, to know that that they are the protectors of their children, that they are the knowledge keepers, from generations of wisdom that is being passed down through their family. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind. But of course, you know, with that generational perspective, we can't ignore that there has been some massive group trauma that has occurred in this country, and that has impacted Indigenous families. And so we oftentimes talk about this as historical trauma. And Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart really did some groundbreaking research around historical trauma, as it pertains to Indigenous populations here in this country. And she provided us this understanding of what historical trauma is, which she describes as a cumulative psychological wound, and that has actually impacted generations and has actually affected people throughout their entire lifespan and has really emanated this massive group trauma. So it's a collective trauma, it's a cumulative trauma. It's also a type of complex trauma in that a lot of the wounds that were created were actually at the hands of people that should have been protecting Indigenous families. And so I think it's important for us to keep in mind how historical trauma has affected Indigenous families. Because today, when we're working with them, there is still ongoing historical trauma. And sometimes, you know, especially in the field of child trauma, we often see trauma happening at an individual level. And so we might forget or maybe not really bring to the forefront that there has also been collective group trauma that has happened, as well as this intergenerational trauma that is occurring. And that is a factor in what we are seeing in terms of the needs that Indigenous families are having today. So we go through an extensive overview of historical trauma in our previous series on tribal organization outreach and collaboration. So I will, you know, refer you guys to that. But for this presentation, I just want to highlight historical traumatic experiences, particularly around boarding schools, because when we're talking about Indigenous families today and the needs that they may have, some of those needs are actually as a result of intergenerational trauma that was caused by adverse boarding school experiences. So one of the things that we know about historical trauma is that it's actually caused from efforts of genocide and ethnocide. And one of the tactics that was used, genocidal tactics that was used against Indigenous peoples, was to remove children forcefully and to remove them into these residential schools. And if you can imagine with me, like today we think about schools and we think about them as places where maybe children are safe, there are loving and caring adults, and they're being prepared for life after, being prepared for their careers, being prepared to be contributing members to society. And so these schools were actually not all working in that way for Indigenous children. In fact, there was a lot of abuse that was happening and a lot of malnourishment occurring, and the ethnocidal tactics that was happening included banning children from speaking their language and trying to change a lot of their cultural ways and spirituality and beliefs and practices. And so it was really to try to convince these children that they should be ashamed of who they are and that they needed to assimilate into a larger society that was very different from their own, and the belief that that larger society was better than their Indigenous societies. And so that's the history, the historical context that we are starting from. And we just share a quote here that really talks about that ethnocide of one of the I guess you could call him a school administrator for the first Indian boarding school, Carlisle Indian School, and General Richard Pratt. And he talks about how the goal was basically to remove any evidence in the children that they were Indigenous children, and to remove any evidence of where they came from and who they were as Indigenous people. So the effects of that particular trauma was intergenerational, but this specifically talks about the immediate effects of the survivors. So those that survived those schools, because there were many children that did not survive those schools. But those that survived those schools and were able to return to their tribal communities, or some of them may never have returned to their tribal communities. But what this study in particular found is that the effects on their family when they grew up and started their own families, these were some of the effects that those boarding schools had. It really caused some of these issues of, the parenting that was really destructive. What was modeled for them at these schools was what they had brought back. And when they started their own families, the parenting that they had in these schools was what they knew. And so it was ineffective and destructive and authoritarian and inconsistent. The insensitivity that they experienced in these schools was carried into their own parenting, and just not struggling with really bonding with their own children. A lot of the survivors actually talk about how difficult it was to even tell their children that they loved them, because they had never been told that in these schools by these caretakers. And some of them had been in these schools their whole childhood. So they never had any other experience. And of course, there was some poor school relations, definitely some weak spiritual foundations, and weak ethnic identity, and just some unhealthy family norms that became a cycle within these families who survived these boarding schools. And historical trauma, we often think about these events as like happening a very long time ago. But these boarding schools, some of the survivors are still alive today and are still speaking about the experiences that they went through.
I just wanted to follow up on a couple of things that Veronica was saying, because a lot of times, especially in the last few years, maybe we've heard a little bit more about boarding schools than maybe we have previously. But understand that once the boarding school era was over, it didn't mean that the philosophy behind the boarding school era was over. And by that, I mean that the next thing that happened was that the Child Welfare League of America had a contract with the federal government for removal of children from families to be fostered and adopted out into non-native families. This was how pervasive and how intentional it was to really get Indian people not to be Indian people anymore, right? And you do that through their children. So there was a really a concentrated effort, and that effort continued until the Indian Child Welfare Act. And it was just in the early 2000s that there was an actual apology from the Child Welfare League of America. So the other thing that, we kind of talked about the parenting issue, but for years and years in our community, we talk about it as blood memory, right? Blood memory, that we actually carry that memory in our blood, in our being, which to a Western way of articulating that seemed very unscientific. But here we are today in this day and age, and we're finding out, of course, through Western science now is catching up with our indigenous knowledge, and have things like epigenetics, which basically shows that there are cellular memories that are held within, our cells. And so that description of blood memory was actually very accurate. And as we begin to really rediscover, and the reason these things are so important, like why are we talking about historical trauma? We're talking about engaging families and communities, because if you don't have that base, then it's hard to understand some of the interactions that are happening. So when we look at the systems level trauma, we know the big ones like racial discrimination and poverty and food insecurity, housing issues, and involvement with juvenile justice. We're every single system that has touched the lives of Indigenous people, even within those other systems, we have not had good outcomes. We have not had good outcomes when it comes to the medical, our physical being. And part of that has to do with those institutions, that institutionalized way of beginning something, like for the rest of the country when they were having, medical interventions. It was very different than when your medical attention is born within the Department of War. So Indian Health Services was created in the Department of War. Now it's since switched to the Department of Interior, but that's where it got grounded. And even today, Indian Health Services is a service department. So you're going to find captains, and you're going to find those service designations, because even though it's public service, it still has that rooting, that root in that military kind of thing. So you can see how that shows up in our justice systems. We know we're overrepresented. So there's all of these places where we're really in the soup of it. So it's not like you're going to be interacting with Indigenous people and they're not coming with all of this, right? Next slide, please. So how does that show up? Like, what does that mean? Especially if you're in a helping profession, when you know that it is the very professions, the very helping professions that have done extreme damage. So already you're going into a mistrustful situation, right? Say that you're working in the field of mental health and you don't know that historical trauma for that particular family, but maybe that historical trauma includes things like woman goes in to have a baby and she ends up having the baby, but she also ends up being sterilized because she went to an Indian Health Services that was the policy, right? And maybe you're going to be interacting with an Indigenous person who is coming to you for help, but the very place where they went to seek help, they lost a child within a residential setting, or within something within a detention center, or or a hospital. You know, when we look at how many of these events actually happen within our supposed safe spaces, right? And again, it's this cumulative trauma. It's not the one thing, it's not the interaction that you may be having with them, but what are they coming in with? What is the invisible suitcase filled with that they're bringing, your backpack or what, however you want to look at that analogy? What are they bringing into the room and what are you bringing into the room? And most services come from a Western perspective. And in our traditional ways, I remember one of the elders talking to me, and we were talking about some of our interventions, our traditional interventions. And from a Western perspective, I remember this one elder saying, they all do talk therapy. Like it's all about talk therapy, you know, and some of our ceremonies, there isn't any talk. There's action. Maybe there's songs. Maybe there's other things that are happening. So the services, the way that you determine what's working under what circumstances or for whom from a Western perspective are very, very different. And there's just a lack of cultural knowledge and competency. It's not a criticism, because up until very recently, many people had very little exposure to be able to begin to learn. Like, you know, I say it wherever I go because it makes so much sense to me. But my friend Menage Hill, who's from Standing Rock, and we used to do training together, and he used to always say, if you want to learn about us, go to the library. There's some great books out there, right? Tell you all the information. But if you want to know and understand us, then you have to come and spend time with us. So next slide. So you can see that all of these become barriers to any kind of engagement, whether it's individual or at the community level. So, you know, those historic or those trauma responses, like I said, you don't know the tip of the iceberg, you know what you see on the outside, but you have no idea what's going on down below. And that historic mistrust. When Veronica was talking about parenting skills, imagine we're not talking one generation of not being parented, but now we're talking 3 and sometimes even 4 generations. We're 3 or 4 generations removed from that initial trauma, and yet the ramifications of that continue on to all kinds of ways that it shows up in families and our parenting skills. And all the ways that we cope with that, substance use, our mental health issues, even the way that we talk about mental health issues. I noticed that somebody in the chat is doing a lot of work with systems of care. And I've been working with some tribal systems of care recently, and every single one of them that I was working with, and there was a group of 10 different communities, and they all said that they refused to call it systems of care because systems have done so much damage. And so they renamed their initiative to societies of care, because societies care, systems don't care. Systems are systems. Even though they're made up of people, the systems themselves do not care, but societies care. So I thought it was a well-made point of kind of a shift in thinking. So all of these kinds of things are things that are barriers to engagement. And I think the most important thing to remember here is that, you know, there's not an expectation that you know everything, but to enter into those relationships with some real cultural humility. So Veronica, I'll turn it back over to you.
So we've discussed now what the suitcases, the invisible suitcases that Indigenous families may be carrying And of course, that goes both ways, right? We as service providers are also carrying our own invisible suitcases, maybe from the traumas that we've been through. So it's not just a one-sided thing. But the other part of the story is that in addition to intergenerational trauma, there has also been intergenerational transmission of healing from one generation to the next. In Indigenous families, there are families that have experienced healing. There are families that have broken the cycle, that are working to break the cycle. There are families that are not burdened with what happened generations ago. They are working despite ongoing trauma that continues to happen today, despite maybe their lives being touched by poverty today, despite maybe having to continue to seek health services through Indian Health Service. Despite those things, there's still families that are working on healing themselves and their families. And this is less researched. I think there's a lot more research around the trauma that Indigenous peoples carry, but this focus is less researched, but we do know that it's happening. And part of the reason why it's happening is because Indigenous peoples have always been more than the hardships and adversities that they've been through. Even with colonization happening, there has always been some strengths that Indigenous peoples have carried. We often hear stories of how Indigenous peoples have resisted colonization. Indigenous peoples have really fought. There's the stories of how Indigenous peoples, when their spirituality was outlawed, that they went underground in order to maintain some of those spiritual practices and ways of being. So we've always had families that have worked really hard to continue to overcome the hardships that they have been faced with. And so some of those reasons why they have been able to overcome these things are just some of these experiences, some of these characteristics, some of these conditions of environment that Indigenous peoples have built for themselves, like their spirituality, like their compassion, their empathy, their humor, their friendships, and the kinship systems that they have within their communities, and the values that they carry within their communities that have continued to remain intact. So these, it's important to see our families wholly, holistically, I guess, for who they are, even though we want to be mindful and of some of the trauma that Indigenous families may be carrying. We also want to be mindful that Indigenous families have been resilient, and they have the potential to continue to be resilient and to increase their resilience. They may enter your office, and at that point in time, perhaps they didn't seem or feel too resilient, but don't count out the possibility that they can build up their resilience, they can overcome what they're faced with. Don't give up on them when it seems like their hardships are winning out. I think that's something that's really important. And what's really going to happen, be helpful for them, is to really look at those unique strengths that they have because of who they are and their identity, and because of the community, the tribal nation that they come from, that they do have those unique strengths. that they can draw upon as protective factors. So hopefully that was helpful to you to kind of set the stage about, as we're beginning to talk about how to engage Indigenous families, how we can do that better in the work that we do. We want to now give you guys time to speak with one another and have discussion with one another. We want to ask you to spend some time talking in breakout rooms with your small group about the experiences of the Indigenous families that you serve. So if you're not currently serving any Indigenous families, think about this in terms of maybe the Indigenous families that are living in your community. Some of them might be invisible to you at this point in time, but likely they are living within your community. And so these are the questions that we wanted you to think about. How does historical and contemporary trauma impact those families? And what are the barriers that you're seeing them struggle with? And are you seeing healing and resilience within those families? And so we're going to give you guys 12 minutes in the breakout room, and there is a document that is shared in chat that has those questions for you that you can refer to while you're in the breakout room, and some of the instructions as well to kind of help guide you. We are going to have some time when you come back from the breakout room, and we're going to ask for a few groups to volunteer to share what they discussed, so we can hear what conversations you guys were able to have. So we'll go ahead and launch those breakout rooms. Well, it looks like everyone is back in the room. So thank you all so much for taking that time to connect with others and to discuss the experiences of the Indigenous families that you work with or that are in your community. We're going to go ahead and have about 2 to 3 groups volunteer and share out with this whole group. And we're just going to ask that your spokesperson come off mute and just give us about a 1 or 2 minute summary of what was discussed. And feel free, if you want to focus on one of the questions posed or all. Okay, Becky, I see your hand raised. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. So we didn't really have the opportunity to, elect a leader or a spokesperson. So I will just go ahead and do that. We did have someone who was not able to open the link for some reason, but so for us, a couple of people don't exactly work with the Native communities, but they are around, so they want to learn more about how they're going to best interact with them. And then a couple of us do. I am one of the ones that does work directly with the Native communities and families. And so for the question number 1, generally we see the historical, or I see the historical and even the contemporary trauma daily, how it impacts families. Something as simple as I work with TANF families that are on rancherias, which in California is what we call the smaller reservations, and then also the rancherias own their land, unlike some reservations. But they almost have been raised to think that living on TANF is the only way to live. So trying to get past, that dependence on the government is really difficult. And I do hate the word barriers. So question number 2, what barriers? So instead of barriers, when I work with participants, I always use the word situations, because for me, barriers means full stop. and situations is just something to deal with and work with. So, again, that generational trauma tends to be our biggest situation that we're working with, because it does cause the more quote unquote contemporary traumas like, substance abuse and, family inability to bond and raise their children, or, even domestic violence, those types of things. So those are things that we see frequently. And then have I seen healing, or have we seen healing and resilience with Indigenous families? Yes, absolutely. Even if it's as small as admitting that, they do have these traumas that they're working with. For us, we really like to recognize the wins, no matter how small they are. So
Yeah. Thank you so much, Becky.
absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah. What you were speaking to about, the dependency, I think it goes back to, for those that don't know, when reservation land was established, that some tribal nations, ended up on reservations, and so, land that was set apart for them, um, and it usually, sometimes it was like their traditional land that they, were connected to, but sometimes it was land that they were, placed on. Um, and there was a lot of, rations, government rations that were issued, and, sometimes even, a lot of families were starving because those rations were not enough. But, at that time, families, had to be dependent on those government rations. And, so I think that's, this, to me, how, just looking at the history of that, where some of that dependency began, is, just, some of those food rations, and, all kinds of different ways in which, Indigenous peoples were conditioned to be solely dependent on the federal government, for their needs and survival. Any other group that would like to share your discussion? No takers? All right. Well, thank you guys so much for taking that time to, um, really share with one another what your experiences are, and, what you're seeing being the needs of the families that you're serving, and also the strengths that they hold. And so I hope that that was helpful for you all. Before we move forward, we do have a couple of questions in chat that we wanted to answer from, what we've covered so far. So I'm going to pass it over to Shannon to respond to those questions.
Yeah, thanks, Veronica, and thanks, Becky, for being willing to share and to, and to say, to speak what people experience, right? Which is, kind of the effects of those long-term traumas and how they play out. So, there was Lizzie, you asked a question about, you wanted to know one more time, who the Child Welfare League of America had a contract with, and it was with the federal government. So under Health and Human Services, just as many of you might have grants that come under Health and Human Services, and you know that you have a certain charge under those grants. Well, one of the charges under the funding of the Child Welfare League of America was to, to actively place Native children in non-Native homes. So, and then Danielle, I had a question about were the school governments in conjunction with the church. Some of them were. That happened actually more in what we call grandmother country in Canada in terms of the Anglican and the Catholic and the Methodist churches. But in the States here, it was more, at least initially, it was more under the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and really thinking again, remember what I said about that the military control that was in place. And it was really kind of that military, even as you notice, the quote that Veronica had up there from General Pratt, that all came under kind of a military intervention. And Lizzie, I see your hands up. Did you have another question?
I did. Yes, thank you. I just wanted to also clarify, I loved what you said about societies of care versus systems of care. And I just want to make sure that that's what you said, that was kind of the alternate naming was societies of care. Do you mind revisiting that for a second?
Yes, that's absolutely true. I went to I do some technical assistance for the systems of care. And with our tribal systems of care met last summer. And during that time, that's what was discussed, and they are actually using in a couple of the tribal systems of care initiatives. They're actually using societies of care. They're not using the terminology systems of care.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I appreciate that clarification.
Yeah. And more, and they are proactive about wanting to engage other people in that in the future. So great. And so just the other question, there still are boarding schools. There still are Bureau of Indian Affairs run boarding schools. The difference, of course, is that there's no mandate that you have to send your children there. There's nobody coming to your door to take your children to these schools. But the schools themselves, sometimes there's a good reason to have a boarding school, and some of those schools have really great reputations. But there still exists, I think, I can't remember, it's less than a half a dozen BIA run boarding schools currently operating. So, so all of that to say, we really have to switch our view to a trauma-informed view anytime you're working with if you're going to engage Indigenous families and Indigenous communities. And it really is that switch from what's wrong with your family, what's wrong with your community, to what happened to your family, what happened to your community. So if you're interacting with a community where there's high levels of substance abuse, high levels of children being removed from their birth homes, high levels of violence, all of those maybe some gang activity, saying what's wrong. Everybody knows what's wrong. And what's wrong is that you've got all this activity that's happening that's not healthy. But if you switch the question to what happened, and to really begin to unpack about, kind of what happened, and those communities are very different. So every community has its own history. So it's not just the individual's history, but the community's history as well. Next slide, please. And we're really going to get into more kind of the strategies and on our next session. But we really want to remind you of these 4 R's of when you're working with, I think, any people, but we're really focused on our Indigenous population here. But that respect, having respect, no matter what the person's circumstances are, we all deserve that respect on a human level, even if we've chosen unhealthy ways in which to cope in our lives. To be responsible, meaning that whatever you're saying, follow through. At the very least, don't contribute to the experience to date, right? And understand reciprocity. We get into these relationships, and many times if we're dealing with non-native people, they're still operating over the I'll be blunt, the great white savior complex. Like, we have something you need and we're going to come in and help you because you're such a poor population, right? As opposed to understanding anytime you're having an interaction, there's reciprocity involved. And meaning that it's not just what you have to give, but what you have to learn. What are the richnesses that are going to, and the gifts that will be given to you? And understanding that whatever that interaction, remember I asked you, what's the purpose of your engagement? That it have relevance, that it really has some purpose to it beyond, idle curiosity. And that you have a reverence for the experience of that indigenous population. So next slide, please. Yeah. I'm going to let Veronica talk a little bit about these different kinds of relationships.
So we did cover this in our last event on tribal organization outreach and collaboration. But I won't go into too much detail on it, but I will. We're going to bring this framework up again and just kind of describe the different ways in which there has been relationships with Indigenous peoples, and oftentimes these relationships have been in a formal manner. But the first type is to inform. So a lot of times systems have really come to be in relationship with Indigenous peoples, specifically to inform them. Some of it might be some of that white savior complex, but it's also about just wanting to get information to communities in order for them to be empowered with that information. The other type of relationship has been to involve, which has been really engaging Indigenous communities in participating in the planning and implementation of your programs and activities. And then another type has been to consult, which is really seeking out Indigenous peoples for their input to inform your program's practice, your agency's practice. And then collaborates is where there's more of that reciprocity happening, to where agencies and programs are working together with Indigenous peoples to design, plan, organize, and implement programming and activities to really shape the services that are being provided to Indigenous communities as well as to other peoples. And the next type of relationship is what's referred to as the big C consults. And typically, this often happens more at a federal government level to tribal government level because of the sovereignty of tribal nations. So it wouldn't be, this isn't describing like an individual person's relationship with a tribal nation or with a tribal community. It's more of that official government to government relation between the federal government and the tribal nation, who are both distinct sovereign nations, and the relationship that is built between them to inform policy and practice. So there's a lot of mandates and different systems that really come through the federal government that in which there's mandates to consult Indigenous people. So that oftentimes this is what this is referring to. And then the last type is you might be in a position where you're working for a tribal nation. And so in that capacity, you maybe you're working for a program or a department that is exercising their tribal sovereignty and self-determination, to where the tribe is able to have decision-making power and to drive the purpose and direction and implementation. So you might be just providing, a service to that tribal nation who is leading that work. So these are just the different types of relationships that might be occurring with Indigenous peoples. And we do have a poll that we wanted to launch right now. As we're getting ready to talk about strategies, we want to see where everyone is coming from in terms of their experience engaging Indigenous families. So we can keep that in mind as we talk about strategies. So the question is, do you currently engage Indigenous families in the work you do? And yes, you are. It's happening at an agency level. Yes, you are, and it's happening at an individual level. Yes, you are, and it's happening at both of those levels, or maybe not right now. Okay, I think we got the majority of folks who have responded to this poll. So whether, regardless of what type of relationship you have right now, we're just wanting to know whether or not that engagement is happening. And so it looks like 41% are engaging at both an agency and individual level, and 31% is not engaging with Indigenous families right now. And some folks are engaging more at an individual level, 16%, and some folks may not be engaging at an individual level, but maybe they know that their agency is engaging with Indigenous families, and that's 12%. So thank you guys so much for taking that poll. That really helps us be mindful of who we're speaking to and the experiences that you guys are having. So we do have just a few minutes left. So Shannon.
Sure. We'll revisit this next time, but we started talking about families and we went into kind of the historical experience of Indigenous families, but we didn't really define families, right? So just understanding when we talk about families, it's really up to the family to define what that means. That families come in all kinds of shapes and sizes, and in our communities, many of our Indigenous communities, we have very different definitions of relatives and families. I can have a auntie who I have no blood relationship to, but in all purposes, she's part of my family and will continue to be part of my family. So we just want to recognize when we talk about families, if you're going to be engaging, to understand that definition, your definition of family and their definition of family, or your agency's definition of family and their definition of family may be very different. Next slide, please. So, Veronica talked about types of relationships, and we're going to go a little deeper next time into this, but we're really going to talk about what does it mean to engage with Indigenous families at an individual level, at a service delivery level, and then how are you actually partnering with families in order to do the work that you're doing. So next slide, please. And we have provided this handout as well, but this is the definition that Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration has used to really forward things like systems of care, children's mental health initiatives. This is always also operating within justice systems, that families have a primary decision-making role in the care of their children. And we're going to unpack this next time. We're going to unpack what exactly does that mean. And we have, I'm going to let Veronica talk a little bit about some of the handouts that are being posted, so that we're going to do a deeper dive into, okay, now we know what the water we're swimming in terms of historical trauma, both individual experiences and collective experiences. But now what does that mean when it comes down to actually engaging with families? So, And I'll turn it back over to you, Veronica, mindful of time and for everybody to really get the most out of what we have to offer today.
Yeah, so I'll be wrapping up for us. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. There is a couple of actually several handouts in the chat for you all. I do want to point out the pathway handouts because you'll get an email in a couple of days about the homework, but that is one of the homework before next week. Is to take a look at that document, the pathways document that comes from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And also part of the homework will be for you to, if you don't already know, think about where family voice exists within your agency. And if it's non-existing within your agency, where you find it in your community, in the service community that you're serving. So those are just some last thoughts for you all. Just want to thank everyone for joining us today. And we really appreciate your feedback and your questions and your involvement in the discussions. And we'll see you again next time.
Thank you so much, Veronica and Shannon. This has been just a great, safe, and welcoming space for this discussion. And I know that we're all looking forward to diving into those strategies and applications next week as well. As Veronica mentioned, there will be a message that you will get in the next couple of days that will have the slides and recording from today's session, as well as the homework that Veronica just mentioned. Of course, the homework is optional, but will absolutely help you to dig into this content and really understand and be ready for next week's session. And we will provide the link for that pathways document that she mentioned in that email. We appreciate that you all joined us today, and we can't wait to see you all on next Wednesday. If you have any difficulty at all with the link for next Wednesday, just send us a note at Caltrin, and we will help you out by resending your registration confirmation. Thanks, everyone.